Hello, everyone. I'm George Canyon. Welcome to Life as a Diabetic, the highs and the lows. This is episode 3. We are having so much fun getting to do all these episodes. And this episode actually is very exciting for me. We're going to get to talk to a friend of mine, young fella by the name of Austen McDonald. I won't get into it yet because we have to get him on the line on Skype. But this episode's all about aviation, which is a real passion of mine. It's been a passion of mine since I was very, very young. And as I said in episode 1, I drove mom and dad crazy. Every time an airplane would be flying over, I'd be like, stop the car, I got to get out. And I'd have to see this airplane fly over. I wanted to be an Air Force pilot so bad until of course, I was told I could never be in the Air Force and I could never fly airplanes. At the age of 14, I was diagnosed as type 1 diabetic, as you all know, and it's been a very, very long, arduous fight sometimes, just trying to, I guess, bury those dreams deep down inside, but finally, getting to be a pilot now for the last 11, 12 years and getting to fly airplanes and be a part of making changes in Canada with Transport Canada. I never dreamt that could ever happen. But it has, and the guest we have today is a true inspiration to all type 1 diabetics, young and old. And it's the one thing I always say, the type 1 diabetic community is the most positively stubborn people I've ever met. And what I mean by that is they are positively stubborn. They put their mind to something, you get it done. You see, when you're diagnosed as a type 1, you're forced to kind of grow up overnight. It's like jumping into ice cold water 2 feet first, no option. You don't get to dip your toe in. And that whole process of having to take on responsibility, be determined and dedicated, it has to be adopted quickly when you're first diagnosed, and even adult onset. I've talked to 40-year-olds who all of a sudden were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and they said the same thing. They said, wow, I thought I was a responsible adult, but when I got type 1 diabetes, I learned discipline and I learned responsibility like I'd never seen before. And that's our guest on the podcast today is the perfect example of that, and getting to know him and his dad family quite well over the last few years has been a true honor to me. So without further ado, because I will just go on and on and on, and we need to definitely be hearing from Austen, let's get him on the line right now. Well, as promised on episode 3 here, we've got my buddy, Mr. Austen McDonald, type 1 diabetic since he was 13 years old, lives up in Edmonton, born and raised in St. Albert, Alberta, and live right now on Skype. Austen, how you doing, pal?
Good morning, George. I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm doing awesome. I don't let the cat out of the bag and say who you work for or do any of that stuff. So let's go right back to the beginning for you, which is not too long ago. The day you were diagnosed. Let's talk about right before you were diagnosed. Right before, because this is something that is so important for people that are not diabetic to understand how we all have different symptoms and we all go through different things. So lead me into when you went to the hospital for your diagnosis. Prior to that, what were you experiencing?
Okay, well, I was a pretty normal kid growing up, pretty athletic. I played rugby competitively at the age of 13, 14 years old for Team Alberta and stuff like that. Nice. That winter I was training to get better, hitting the gym a lot, and then all of a sudden I got a weird infection on my finger that wouldn't heal, and went to the doctor, had that last a few times, and to no avail, and we kind of just moved on from it, and every once in a while would have to take a course of antibiotics. But then shortly after Christmas I really started to lose a lot of weight, basically lost close to 30 pounds in 2 or 3 weeks. Drinking water all the time, going to the bathroom night and day, to the point where my mom, who was a former psychiatric nurse and a dentist, kind of noticed things weren't going too normally. She's seen this story before, and he took me to the doctor, which at first didn't believe me that I had something wrong. He thought I was actually on drugs, which was quite interesting.
Really?
Yeah, actually, we went and got blood work done that day. Went home and kind of passed out for a while. Went back to the Medi Center because we hadn't heard anything a few hours later. And again, the next doctor didn't believe me until he checked the labs, and he told me to go straight to the Stollery Children's Hospital after he did, because I was in severe ketoacidosis. So that's basically how it started. Spent 3 days at the Stollery Children's Hospital in Edmonton, Alberta, with a bunch of great staff. They took great care of me, and I went through their 2-week outpatient program that taught me how to be a diabetic.
Wow, 3 days.
3 days.
Oh,
3 days in the hospital and 2 weeks of outpatient. And I was admitted to the hospital February 1st. So just coming up on, or just past 10 years now.
Just past 10 years. So you're 24 now, is what you're saying.
Turning 24 tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow morning. Oh, man. Well, 10 years as a type 1 diabetic. And so you haven't seen the old archaic days. And I saw them, but I wasn't diabetic then. It was my grandma that I got to see that. As far as your treatment goes, let's talk about how you treat yourself now without letting the cat out of the bag so much.
At first I was actually on MDI, and then basically that fit my rugby life after I was diagnosed. I continued playing rugby competitively, and insulin pump didn't make sense. But once I stopped playing rugby, there was no other option in my mind besides an insulin pump. And so I'm on the Insulet Omnipod right now, as well as the Dexcom G5. I'm switching over to the G6 soon. I just need to get rid of or use up the last of the G5 sensors.
Nice. Well, you're actually treating yourself the same way I treat myself. So there's, and rightly so. A lot of type 1s are treating that way right now, and you just can't go wrong treating that way. So let's move into a little more of the skinny of this podcast, which we're going to get into rather quickly here. But before we do, what does your dad do for a living?
My dad is a professional airline pilot with Air Canada. He is a captain on the Boeing 787.
Yeah, I knew. I just had to set it up. And that's, of course, Captain Ed McDonald. If you're ever flying on one of his flights, good luck. I mean, enjoy yourself. I have to rib him. You have to give him a hard time.
That fly out of Calgary, beware.
Hopefully he's not listening. I'll never get on one of those flights again. So you kind of grew up with aviation then?
Yeah, so basically when I was born, my dad was a pilot with Canadian Airlines, and before that he was in the Air Force, and flying had been basically our life. I grew up with a father's an airline pilot, which presented its own unique benefits and challenges. But basically I was bitten with the flying bug really early on in my life, and I always thought airplanes were cool and interested by mechanical things. And I had my first fan flight with my dad in the back seat of a small Piper Warrior or something in Cold Lake, and never looked back. Yeah. So
as far as flying goes, now you're diagnosed at 13. So there's no way you're even looking at a pilot's license at the age of 13. So obviously you were thinking a career in aviation. What was your first step?
So before I was diagnosed, the plan for me was to essentially follow the similar footsteps my dad did, get an engineering degree, go into the Air Force, and then eventually make my way to the airline pilot career. Unfortunately, the first thing they tell you when you're diagnosed type 1 diabetic is you can be anything you want except being in the military and flying professionally. So that was a bit of a hit, and I internalized it in my own way. I decided to focus on rugby, and then eventually focused on getting my engineering degree at the University of Alberta. But the funny thing is, you can never really shy away from the bug once you have it. When I was in grade 12, I got my recreational pilot's license, which basically allowed me to fly a 2-person bug smasher around in good weather, which is a fun activity. That's actually the purest, most joy flying I've ever done. But I still wanted more. It wasn't really until my dad flew with someone by the name of Steven Steele that I realized that potentially being a professional airline pilot was a possibility, because Steven himself was a airline pilot, but then was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes later in his career. And he had lost his license initially, but fought back to be one of the few that regained his license after diagnosis. So after hearing that, it kind of rejuvenated my passion for wanting to become a pilot. And basically through the work we did together, we were able to push transport. I don't know how much more you want
Yeah,
back.
we won't get too far into it because we're going to save that for another episode or two. That may take two episodes, but we're definitely going to have you back on to talk about that whole process. But hopefully with your dad, because your dad was an integral part of all that as well, and maybe even get Steve in there as well because he's retired now anyway. So what's he really doing? He's just probably
Exactly right.
hanging out at home.
Bahamas, right?
So you get your rec pilot's license. And of course, now you have to get your private pilot's license at some point.
Yeah.
And so, take me from where did you go from there? Okay, so you have your rec, and now you're going to go to what school?
So I did my rec at the Edmonton Flying Club,
Right.
and kind of the interesting turn of fate was I wanted to become a better pilot as a rec pilot. So I went to the Mayo Flying Club in Edmonton out of Villeneuve,
Yeah.
and I learned how to fly their tailwheel Citabria. And during that time is kind of when we got in contact with you, as well as I found out about Stephen Steele, and I got on the insulin pump at that time.
Mm-hmm.
It was able to get my Category 3 medical, which allowed me to become a private pilot. And at that time at Namao, I got my private pilot's license done on the Citabria, and then went across the street to Centennial Flight Center to do my multi-engine instrument rating on a Piper Seneca 3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's and then from there, of course, without giving too much away, once we had convinced gently, sometimes not so gentle, convinced transport to allow a type 1 diabetic, of course, to become a commercial pilot, first in the world, that was you.
That was. It's kind of weird to think back on, but yeah, I'm the first commercial pilot with pre-existing diabetes in Canada and likely the world as well. So that's
I'm pretty sure it's the world because from what I heard, Canada was the first.
Yeah.
I know I heard a story the other day that, of course, the U.S. have or are following suit. I believe Australia is following suit as well, but don't hold me to any of this. This is hearsay, but I did read a few things that had said that. But so you're now a commercial airline pilot without a job, and where do you go? Who do you apply to? I'm gonna guess probably your dad is with Air Canada, so that would make sense.
Yeah, family ties run deep with Air Canada. The funny thing is everything timing wise worked out great. I was when I got my multi-engine rating, I was in second year university at the University of Alberta. I was doing a co-op program, so I was supposed to have a work term. But I kind of doubled down on wanting to become a commercial airline pilot. And during my work term, I went to Seneca Flight College in Peterborough, Ontario for an 8-month program. And with that, they essentially trained me how to be a multi-crew pilot to the best of my abilities. And with that, it presented a great opportunity to interview with Jazz Aviation, who operates on behalf of Air Canada Express.
Right.
And so after I finished that program, however, I still at that time didn't have my Cat 1 medical. I came back to Edmonton, finished off my engineering degree, and in the last throes of the semester, I got my medical and my commercial pilot's license, and did all the requisite exams in order to apply to Jazz, and got an interview. And a few months later, I was hired at Jazz Aviation in August of 2019.
First Officer Austen McDonald.
First Officer, yeah, and I drew the Dash 8 Q400, which is awesome. It is an awesome airplane. It's a sports car, in my opinion, and I've been flying the line since about November.
Now, your first flight, which I got to be on, which was hilarious because I've never done that in my life, as far as getting on an airplane to fly to Saskatoon and get off and get back on and fly back to Calgary. But
at 5:30 in the morning.
5:30 in the morning. Now, on that flight, I believe you said that because that was your first line flight, you weren't, you had to wait 2 landings or 2 takeoffs or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it had to be 3 landings and takeoffs I had to observe as pilot monitoring. So it's not like I'm sitting there with my hands on my legs. I'm doing
Yeah.
doing a lot of the typing, doing a lot of the work,
Yeah.
talking to air traffic control. But the following day, I got to do my first landing in Kamloops, BC.
Yeah.
And the funny thing was actually it ended up that there was a JDRF researcher who had saw your Facebook videos the day before.
Yeah.
That was on my flight that morning. So actually, right after my first landing, I ran into the terminal there and got a picture with her. I'll see if I can find.
That's awesome. I think I remember hearing that story actually.
Yeah,
So
it's a small world. Just,
take us through that, because I've got sim time on a Q4, and as a private pilot, been blessed to fly a lot of aircraft. But when it comes to big heavy haulers, no, I have not. So, you're landing a 172, which everybody knows is usually the aircraft you start learning on when you're getting your pilot's license. We know what it's like to land that, even a twin. Even at Seneca, we know what it's like to land. But what's it like to land a Q400?
It's it's an interesting machine because it's essentially the same wing and design as the classic Dash 8, but it weighs a lot more. So It's a lot heavier on the controls. You have to be a lot more on the power. You have to be in front of the airplane, which makes it a bit of a challenge, and it's quite fun to fly. But it's a lot heavier, and going from a excuse me, a 172 to a Q400 is a pretty big jump. It sits a lot higher on the ground, and when you're kind of coming 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet over the runway, you're kind of going, okay, I should probably start pulling back on the stick now because the ground's starting to get a little big.
When the ants get bigger, that means it's time to flare.
Exactly.
So now that we could talk airplanes all day, but as life as a diabetic, which is what the podcast is, the highs and the lows, let's talk about your diabetes control when you're in the cockpit. What do you have? What are the stipulations? What do you have to be doing when it comes to that? Now you are on a CGM and an insulin pump, making the world a bit easier for you.
Yeah. So just to underline here, the CGM is absolutely one of the only reasons why I can say I have the control I have. It gives me the background knowledge on what my body's doing at all times. However, Transport Canada protocol says I have to still use traditional finger pokes. So essentially before a flight, usually about 15 minutes before takeoff, I'll poke my finger, draw blood, and it has to be between a certain range, between 6 and 16 is the range. And I like to keep my blood sugar between about 7.5 to 12 during flying. And then every hour in cruise, same thing, poke has to be between a certain range. If I drop below or above that range, I'm allowed to correct a little bit, either with sugar or a little bit of insulin. And then 30 minutes before landing, so usually about top of descent or just prior to top of descent, I'll poke my finger once more. Mm-hmm. And so depending on the day, I could go from doing 4 tests in a day to up to 12. I think I've done 14 tests in a period of 8 hours. So it can be tough on the fingers, but in order to be in the range I need to fly and not cause any delays saying, I need a snack. The CGM is by far the one tool I use the most in terms of making it in that range and keeping it there.
It's amazing. I mean, with an iWatch on too, you can literally turn your wrist and see your sugar and go back to your business.
Exactly.
It's so quick. I'm sure Transport Canada will eventually, catch on with that. I understand where their mindset is with the traditional, poke and check, but the Dexcom CGM is so bloody accurate. It scares me how accurate it is, and I've put the G6 through its tests, taking my sugar from my finger and then checking it against what my phone is telling me, which of course the watch is telling me as well. And it is unbelievable for me. Thank God for technology, or you wouldn't be sitting in the cockpit, eh?
Exactly. Well, and that's the I can understand when they made the rules in the 80s or even before then, obviously. Diabetics not being able to fly with, you had to pee on a stick and wait hours, and that was your blood sugar. Even before that, that's hard to control and regulate. But nowadays, with the technology we have with instantaneous glucose measurement, there's no reason why diabetics can't fly.
Well, and the other thing too, and a lot of people don't realize this, parents of a type 1 diabetic kids will of course agree 100%. The level of discipline that you all of a sudden have to have and are thrust into is incredible. And every type 1 diabetic kid I've met, young and old alike, the level of discipline scares me. Like, they're just so regimented. And even if you're not in tight control, this level of regiment just exists. And so I would be I would always and will always be happy to know there's a type 1 diabetic in the cockpit of anything I'm flying in, because I know that discipline level is there, and they're just going to be an amazing pilot.
Yeah. We, as pilots, we follow the same sort of strict procedures and standard operating procedures and calls that diabetics do. It's kind of interesting. It fits like a hand in a glove kind of thing.
It does. Next thing, military. Next thing we do is we convince the military, because I've said this and I'll continue to say it. You get a platoon of type 1 diabetics in the military, there's nothing they're not going to accomplish. They'll figure out how to fly to the space without a space shuttle. It's amazing to watch. Well, Austen, this has been fantastic, and you are a true inspiration to all type 1 diabetics, and especially those type 1 diabetic kids out there. If you happen to be one of those kids listening, this is living proof right here, what we would call back in the old days, proof in the pudding, that if you take control of your diabetes, you can live your dreams like First Officer Austen McDonald, who I would venture a guess will soon be Captain Austen McDonald.
I can't give you a timeline on that, but it might be soon.
It might be soon. Well, listen, buddy, friendly skies. I don't know. I don't want to go into all the acronyms of keeping the wheels, the rubber side down and all that stuff, but God bless you for fighting the fight and getting out there and flying for Jazz. And hopefully I'll be on one of your flights coming up soon. That would be a lot of fun again. And maybe we can get into the cockpit of one of those aircraft your dad have there. Not Air Canada's aircraft, but one of the smaller ones, because those are the ones that I can handle. I'm not a commercial pilot, so.
We'll make it happen, George.
We will, pal. All the best. Take care of yourself. We'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you later, George. Thanks.
Thanks, buddy. Bye-bye. Well, that was our buddy Austen McDonald, type 1 diabetic since he was 13 years old. And happy birthday, Austen. He just turned 24. Wow, what a story. Unbelievable. And such an example for young type 1 diabetics. Control your disease, control your diabetes, take control of it, and live your dreams. Not just like me, but like First Officer Austen McDonald with Air Canada Jazz. I can't help but smile when I say that, because it's something I never ever thought I'd ever get to say about another fellow type 1 diabetic. And we're going to get into more detail with what happened with Transport Canada, that story. We're going to have Austen's dad, Ed McDonald, on, who was a huge part of getting Transport Canada to allow type 1 diabetics to become commercial airline pilots and hold the Category 1R medical. And we're also going to hopefully talk to retired officer captain Steve Steele, because Steve, the stuff he accomplished before I even could have dreamt of being a part of all this, really truly was industry leading, and it really paved the road for all of us type 1 diabetics. So that's going to be coming up on a future episode as well. Thanks so much for tuning in and being a part of life as a diabetic, the highs and the lows. I'm George Canyon, your host. And until next time, God bless, and take care of your diabetes. We'll see you all soon.